Exhibition has been central to museums since their origin. An exhibition is a specific mode of representation that privileges sight over other senses and visually orders objects to represent larger systems of knowledge and power. This week you read Tony Bennett's Exhibitionary Complex, in which he describes the transfer of objects and bodies from enclosed and private domains into progressively more open and public arenas where, through the representations to which they were subjected, they formed vehicles for describing and broadcasting messages of power. So I thought I'd do a little visual genealogy in the Foucauldian manner of exhibition as a mode of representation. Exhibitions have their origins in the Cabinet of Curiosities, in the German Wunderkammer. In the Cabinet of Curiosities, you have a collection of notable objects, and I would also note that the original term Kammer, or cabinet, also meant room at that time, so a chamber of objects. Cabinets of curiosity have their origin in the Renaissance. The collections they contained could be oddities or scientific specimens representing the complexity of creation. Collections were arranged in encyclopedic fashion, asserting dominance over the natural and human worlds, showcasing intellect, experience, and taste. Skeletons, fossils, insects, birds' nests, taxidermy specimens were all collected alongside works of art, scientific instruments, ancient texts, and artifacts. A wonderful example of this cabinet of curiosities is here in Allworm's Cabinet of Curiosities. The engraving here, a frontispiece of a catalog for the cabinet. Allworm was a 17th century Danish physician, linguist, and natural philosopher who created one of the first museums, the Museum Wormianum. I think that's how you say it, a cabinet of curiosities in his home. Displayed in the cabinet were specimens of the natural world, scientific instruments, and ethnographic objects. The intention was to create a spectacle, but also a source of study and understanding, as Worm wanted to touch and see things and reflect on their meaning outside of their natural environments. So here the meaning was dependent on the way in which the collector saw the collection, creating relationships of meaning through display and visual relationships between objects. Interestingly, Worm's cabinet was recreated by artist Jens Purcell in the installation One Room, first exhibited at the Santa Monica Museum of Art. The installation traveled to other museums, including the Geological Museum at the Natural History Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen, where it has been installed since 2011. Around 40 of the original items from Worm's cabinet, such as the jaw of a horse grown around a root, still exist, and some are even still held by the museum. Another famous cabinet of curiosity was that of the Baron Joseph Bonnier de Mauson, represented here in an 18th century painting by Jacques de la Joux. Bonnier de Mauson's cabinet is recreated in the library attached to the Museum of Natural History in the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. The cabinet dates back to 1735 and was originally housed in Bonnier de Mauson's home, amassed and exhibited thanks to a family fortune based on the procurement of local regional taxes. The cabinet has the quality of combining the atmospheric quality of the Wunderkammer with the organizational intent of later scientific cabinets, producing an original blend of system and fantasy. These wooden cases were acquired by the naturalist Buffon for the Jardin du Roi in 1744, when they were auctioned off following the death of Bonnier de la Maison, who died penniless. They were installed in the king's garden room, and inside these 5 units, made from Dutch wood decorated with serpents, were a collection of preserved or dried animals. Disassembled in 1935, they were then restored and definitively reinstalled permanently in the museum's central library in 1979 and designated as a historic monument. Bonnier de la Mauson's cabinet represents a shift in the technologies of display to embody knowledge and power with the transfer of objects and bodies from enclosed and private domains into progressively more open and public arenas. As Bennett points out, these new exhibitionary forms simultaneously ordered objects for public inspection and ordered the public that inspected them. One early example is Peale's Philadelphia Museum, which opened in 1784. Inspired by 18th century Enlightenment ideals celebrating humankind's capacity to learn, the artist, Charles Willson Peale, conceived his museum as a place where the works of man and nature would coexist for the edification of all. The museum, Peale said, served to instruct the mind and sow the seeds of virtue in the new American Republic. For nearly 50 years, Peale and his family filled the museum with hundreds of painted portraits, thousands of natural history specimens, minerals, models, Asian and American Indian artifacts, archaeological objects, life-size wax figures, fossils, and curiosities, all exhibited to an international public. Another great example is the Wagner Free Institute of Science, also in Philadelphia, perhaps the best known surviving example of this kind of 19th century natural history museum. The exhibits still display artifacts in their original setting, with the artifacts arranged to show categorizations of flora and fauna according to scientific classification. My personal favorite is the case that illustrates the various species of primates, from monkey to chimpanzee to human, embodying through the changing skeletal forms the process of evolution. The point here is to also emphasize humans as the culmination of evolutionary progress. The impulse to categorize, order, and embody was also applied to human cultures, with similar trajectories of primitive progressing to civilization, as we will see in the later international exhibitions. In addition to the need for order, exhibition also relies on display. Visual cultures of display are considered a hallmark of modernity, and this impulse to order and categorize was married in the 19th century with an emergent mode of modern culture of looking, and the rise of what we call now the modern gaze. This culture of looking was tied to visual technologies like exhibition. Early forms, in addition to art galleries, were panoramas, cycloramas, and other spectacles in which visitors could experience a kind of virtual reality. A panorama was a large circular painting that aimed to give the viewer the experience of being physically present in the scene being depicted, whether that was a landscape, a city, a battle, or other historical event. And here you can see definite resemblances to the later cycloramas. Also the diorama, courtesy of French inventor Louis Daguerre, who also was responsible for the daguerreotype, another important feature of this new culture of looking, created the first public diorama, which is a cousin of the panorama. The diorama was one of his many inventions, a multimedia spectacle that took the mid-19th century by storm. The first diorama was constructed in 1822 behind the Place de Château d'Eau, now the Place de la République. Daguerre's studio was located there, and the area was shabby and underdeveloped, consisting of an old army barracks and a smattering of theaters. But once customers entered the theater, they forgot their dilapidated surroundings and were transported virtually to places and moments in history: the Black Forest, the inauguration of the Temple of Solomon, the Great Fire of Edinburgh. The diorama quickly grew extremely popular, garnering as much as 200,000 francs a year during its heyday, which is a remarkable profit for that era. And diorama theaters were built in London and Berlin and other cities, with the most famous tableau touring between European cities. These forms of visual experience linked the early museum to other forms of spectacle and popular entertainment, like the diorama, and also like Barnum's Museum, which displayed oddities and pseudoscientific objects for popular middle-class entertainment. And Barnum's Museum is interesting because it's like, in some ways, the Free Institute, but it's also located on a spectrum, with the museum on one end and the circus, another popular 19th century entertainment, on the other. Barnum's Museum took the liminal and progressively transgressive disorder of the circus and the spectacle of museums and tamed it through order, containing it under glass as an object of study. As Bennett points out, the 19th century was quite unprecedented in the social effort devoted to the organization of spectacles, arranged for increasingly large and undifferentiated publics, and society itself also became a spectacle. The fusion of entertainment and edification through spectacle found its clearest expression in the spate of international exhibitions that punctuated the mid to late 19th century. The first of these was the Crystal Palace, mounted in London in 1851. And Bennett specifically talks about the Crystal Palace in Foucauldian terms, that it's just not one of spectacle, but also of surveillance. The fact that the Crystal Palace was made of glass also kind of increases this sense. And Bennett writes, The Crystal Palace might serve as the emblem of an architectural series which could be ranged against that of the asylum, school, and prison in its continuing concern with the display of objects to a great multitude. The Crystal Palace reversed the panoptical principle by fixing the eyes of the multitude upon an assemblage of glamorous commodities. The panopticon was designed so that everyone could be seen. The Crystal Palace was designed so that everyone could see. The mode was replicated in the Crystal Palace in New York in 1853 with a similar modus operandi, and then later in the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876. The Centennial Exhibition was intended to celebrate the centennial of the United States and transform displays of machinery and industrial process, as well as finished products and objets d'art, into material signifiers of progress, but progress as a collective national achievement with capital as the great coordinator. And it's no accident that there were also links to display and emerging consumer culture, also embodied in the department store as a spectacle of progress. And here we have John Wanamaker's store in the 1870s, in which in which the internal part of the store represents Bentham's panopticon in part, in this kind of open, circular, and highly ordered space. And of course, the building itself, the store building itself, replicated in style and substance the exhibition pavilion of the Centennial Exhibition. The visual ordering of things and peoples reaches its apotheosis in the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, which united spectacle with the visual ordering of knowledge, displaying the worlds of diverse peoples in virtual realities or dioramic settings. These displays showed the progress of culture, with the U.S. at the height of the achievement, both U.S. imperialism and U.S. industrialization, showcasing a collection of others, some displayed on the midway, as former stages of human development. Here power was produced through the ordered representation of otherness, and moreover that order was a totalizing one, which organized and implied the public, the white citizens of imperialist powers, into a unified subjectivity, effacing divisions within the American body politic and constructing a we that was opposed to this other, the beneficiaries of progress and the processes of evolution, opposed to the primitive otherness of conquered peoples. Museums and expositions, and drawing on the techniques and rhetorics of display and pedagogic relations developed in the earlier 19th century exhibitionary forms, provided a context in which working and middle-class publics could be brought together, and the former, having been tutored into the forms of behavior to suit them for the occasion, could be exposed to the improving influence of the latter. This is certainly the idea behind the great museums founded during the Gilded Age and Progressive era in the United States, civic institutions intended to provide civilizing influences to an urban public. The prototypical institution of the Progressive era was the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which opened in April 1870 after a prolonged effort of organization by civic leaders, businessmen, artists, art collectors, and philanthropists. The museum acquired its first object that same year, a Roman sarcophagus, and later important European paintings entered the collection. And the museum opened to the public at its current site at Fifth Avenue and 82nd Street in 1880. The Met stood at the center of this movement to preserve artifacts from the American past for social change and Americanization. Its organizers believed that tasteful and urban domestic environments contributed to good citizenship and recognized the economic advantages of improving American industrial production through design education. And if you want to know more about the genesis of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you can definitely check out Jeffrey Trask's book, American Things. In the next slideshow, we'll take this story further and look at how changing exhibition strategies in the 20th century both reinforced and challenged the terms of the exhibitionary complex.